Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. 80 million people in the year 2020 are displaced as we speak. That's according to the United Nations. Now, of course, this is coming on the heels of violence and persecution around the world. There's also, of course, the context of the pandemic, which needs to be taken into account, certainly. But there's just, it seems throughout the world that on a yearly basis, there are more and more people who are displaced. And there doesn't seem to be an end in sight, right, to the sort of war, violence, political persecution and other forms of persecution that people are suffering and therefore then seeking safety from. And we can talk about probably many people. We can talk about the Rohingya probably and a whole host of other people also that do escape from their respective countries, even Latin American migrants, for example, who try to enter the U.S. seeking a better life, seeking, again, safety from persecution, Eritreans. I mean, the list, I guess, again, as I said, is endless. Right now, we have around 30 million refugees, which is approximately, I believe, 1% or so of the world's population. Again, not a milestone to be proud of at all for the global community. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Alfredo Campos, who is the General Secretary and Head of the Legal Department at Mundus, who is joining us today from Madrid. Joining us from Dhaka is Asif Munier, who is a displacement specialist. He's an ex-member of the UNHCR Bangladesh. Asif and Alfredo, thank you both for joining us here in Scope today. Asif, let me start with you. The number 80 million, of course, it's very hard to wrap one's head around such large numbers, right? But what do you think are the core issues about why on a yearly basis, essentially, we're seeing more and more displaced people?
Thank you. Just a disclaimer, I was not with UNHCR. I was with IOM and worked with UNDP and ILO at different capacities. Coming to the point, yes, I think one broad issue is that the changing scenario in the global politics, which is less tolerant to foreigners, migrants, and refugees. And the political changes, whether it's in the, well, not so much in the recent past in the US, but in the last few years in the US, in Europe, and other parts of the world. Where there are different kinds of crises, of course, as you mentioned, violence and war, but also, natural disasters. So both man-made disasters and natural disasters. And people who are being persecuted, they are being allowed to reside in a second country for some time, but the tolerance level is low for the public and also for the politicians or the leadership, which is less sort of tolerant and sympathetic towards the plight of refugees and people who are forced to move. And that, I think, is one big issue, whether, there are sometimes discussions at the UN level, but sometimes international discussions turn out to be a lip service. And I think this year, as you mentioned, the numbers is much more of a concern because of the pandemic, because a lot of migrant workers in different countries, they have either lost their jobs or about to lose their jobs. They're forced out to go back to their home countries. And, NGOs activists talk about wage theft. Yeah. So some have not been actually, paid their salaries on time and, money. I mean, it's a list endless going on in terms of particularly the pandemic. It's not just directly the pandemic, but the, fallout from the pandemic.
Indeed. We have within Greece, for example, a lot of, migrant camps as well. Displaced people have showed up there. We have, the migrant, quote unquote, crisis, as Europe would call it also. Tell us about within the European context also about how displaced people are viewed, right? What do you think are the root causes of all of this?
Good afternoon. I agree with all the things that I had said my colleague, and in my opinion, in the European context, we have to go to draw attention on the root causes. Okay, so we have a very now at this moment a very worrisome situation. We have a very close conflicts to Europe. We have, for example, giving an example, we can look at the central Sahel in Africa. So we have, in my opinion, it is not only a question of war and conflicts, because we have in this area we have a mix of causes that makes these people to flee. So we have, for example, five causes. That one of them is the weakness of governments. We find very weak central governments, and another very important causes is the extremely power of criminal gangs and extremist groups that makes people impossible to live in their homeland, and obviously they have to flee.
You know, Asif, there's a lot we can talk about, right? But I mean, if I just hone in on war for a moment, do you think that there is, you know, where right now we don't have technically formal wars, where we don't have a global war, of course, we don't have any world war happening at this point in time, at least in that name. Do you think that that is something that maybe many people around the world do not actually appreciate, that there is still significant amounts of violence happening in enough countries, that we have all these displacements also occurring? Because I think that a lot of that is right now seemingly far from sight and then out of people's minds. Is that fair to say?
I would say so, because you know, in the beginning you mentioned about the Rohingyas, and or if you think about the Syrian refugees who had to flee their country. So there's no currently a more visible, say, war by ISIS groups or Al Qaeda, or if you talk about Myanmar, the sort of atrocities by the military authorities in Myanmar. It's not very visible, but the crisis is still there. If you talk about Rohingyas, they're not being able to go back to their homeland. And if you talk about Syrian refugees, or you know, other people who have been displaced, and as my colleague just mentioned, the root causes. Why would a citizen of a particular country have to leave their country? And you're very right that some of these, you know, violence are small scale, and also, you know, we use the term xenophobia, and what I was mentioning before, that there's less tolerance, and that's not always very visible. So how people treat other people, and you know, sometimes it's sort of the fear of, you know, Islamic extremism or some kind of extremism, and the sort of suspicion that the foreigners, especially the migrants and refugees, are causing problems in a particular country. So if the state overlooks that, and as I was mentioning, that this year, for a lot of the countries all over the world, the crisis and the priority has become dealing with the pandemic, and again, the priority for the national citizens. So again, the issues of the refugees and migrants are sidetracked. So yes, you're right that there's no direct conflict, but the conflict in small scale, conflict among people, among groups. Again, I'm coming back to Rohingya issues, you know, within the camps, refugee camps, because of their overcrowded and because of the pandemic, a lot of the law enforcement has been a bit slack. So within that, the armed groups have come up, and there's infighting, and I'm sure there's in different scale infighting among different vested interest groups in, you know, and talk about, you know, organized crime groups, human trafficking, all of that is creating some kind of a violent situation for these people, where they are in fear. And it's not coming up much in the media. Indeed. It's not coming up at policy discussions or at the UN discussions. So, you know, it's not really very much helpful.
Yeah, so Alfredo, what do you make then of this conversation about wars around the world, or just violence around the world in many ways, right? Again, it's out of sight and mind for many people. I imagine that even for many Europeans, there isn't always the context given to them about why people are showing up in Europe, right?
Yeah, we have. I completely agree with my colleagues. We have to consider the small scale conflicts, but we also we have to look and to keep in mind that the European the people, the European societies are passing by a difficult situation because of the pandemic, like everybody in the world, and they have mainly fear. So they have fear from the foreign peoples, and this is fueled by the speech, the far right speech. So the far right speech try to promote this fear from the strain, from the foreigner, and this is a very difficult situation for migrants and refugees, because in my opinion, refugees and migrants are going to continue to come after the pandemic. The pandemic will pass, and after the pandemic, all these people will come again, even more and more people. So the problem is that we are not prepared. First of all, we have to raise awareness of the migrant phenomenon, first of all, to our societies. So because it's a global problem. We cannot deal only one country or a group of countries. We have to even to deal together the countries of origin and countries of reception. So it's quite simple. So we have to work in this way.
Yeah. All right, so we'll have to leave the final word. The clock has gotten the best of us. We sincerely appreciate both Alfredo speaking to us there from Madrid and Asif speaking to us there from Dhaka for taking their time out of their schedules to share their expert insight with us. Asif there is an ex-member of the IOM, not the UNHCR, as I originally said, and we appreciate, of course, him correcting us on that. You know, the number of displaced people right now, by the end of 2019, was around 79.5 million. That's probably now past the 80 million mark, as the UN has indicated right now. Again, these are not milestones to be proud of for the global community. The fact that we are not discussing this sort of thing, the fact that this does not create more outrage on the part of humanity as a whole is in and of itself disturbing also, right? Where we accept the fact to an extent that there are these small-scale wars happening, small-scale persecution or small enough scale persecution that it's not showing up in our headlines. So again, if it's out of sight, it's completely out of mind. But again, these are human beings. And then Europe wonders, for example, why all these people are showing up on its shores. Then Europe or others wonder, you know, exactly why these people are fleeing persecution. Or others, even the U.S., wondering why all these Latin Americans want to come into the U.S. They're fleeing persecution. Bad economic situations, even. All of the above is very much the story of these displaced people, and all of the above, the different contexts, need to be discussed openly, and the role of the international community in all of the above, arms sales, etc., also needs to be discussed, because that is all very much part of this story also. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss the U.S. role in Africa, and we're going to hone in on Somalia, where under Donald Trump, there was actually an increase in involvement in that country. Now, Donald Trump, as he, of course, had promised and had said even at the beginning of his presidency, that he would not be a war president, that he would want to end U.S. military interventions around the world, is now pulling out troops from Somalia, around 700 or so troops that were on the ground there in Somalia in various forms, both for training and other purposes. Now, as I said, of course, Donald Trump did, in fact, increase involvement in Somalia. This is something that not a lot of media has, in fact, covered. But according to many experts, for all intents and purposes, the U.S. goals in Somalia seemingly failed. Why is that? And then what of course, the civilian casualties, which always remain a concern whenever there is any military intervention anywhere in the world on the part of especially external players. Let's discuss that a bit further. And I'm joined by Ovigwe Eguegu, who is a founder of Africa Politica. He's an African geopolitical intelligence. That is an African geopolitical intelligence firm, pardon me. He's also a contributor at Africa Report. He's joining us today now from Abuja. Ovigwe, thank you very much for joining us here in Scope. What do you make of the fact that there hasn't been a lot of talk, in fact, even in international media or even U.S. media, that is, about involvement even in Somalia? I mean, it seems like this is a black hole of information.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. Well, you know, I think one of the reasons why you've seen the U.S. being able to, be engaged in almost what they like to call perpetual war or endless conflict that is made possible by the fact that many people in America don't even know what the extent and scope of, U.S. militarism, abroad. So it's not in the interest of the establishment to educate the American public or let them know what is really going on. All they are aware of is that the U.S. is intervening in certain countries. I can guarantee that many Americans don't even know where Somalia is on the map, but the United States has been bombing in that country for decades now, and it's really quite shocking. But so far we've seen that bombs don't necessarily have an impact when the political process, or even if the political process is there, that political process is not being used as the main platform for resolving the conflict.
Yeah, so I mean, what do you think is the reason why is the U.S. and why has the U.S. been involved in Somalia for so long? I mean, of course, there's always the stated aims of terrorism, extremism. Is it as simple as that?
Well, it is and it isn't. You have to go back to the Bush era when the airstrike against Al-Shabaab started. Al-Shabaab, it's a terrorist group, an Islamic militant group that operates in, particularly in Somalia, but also still carry out attacks in Kenya and the wider Horn of Africa or East Africa region. So under Bush's war on terror, we saw airstrikes against Al-Shabaab, and then in the Obama years there was an expansion in drone wars and serious air bombardments. And then with Trump, there was even a further escalation. So even if, in these years, the Al-Shabaab threat to America is not necessarily, great in the extent of, as we would say, with ISIS. But Trump, for some reason, escalated, the conflict significantly, declaring it an area of active hostilities. This led to an increase in U.S. bombing. For instance, the bombings went from 23 to 45 between 2016 to 2017, and even just last year, which is the year with the greatest amount of bombing, there were 93 airstrikes. This was reported by Air Wars that monitors air bombings, and it's shocking how so much bombardment can be going on in a country. Mind you, with Trump's administration, the airstrikes were conducted with less stringent rules to prevent civilian casualties. And even the reporting of civilian casualties was rolled back by Trump himself. So by doing that, the American public is no longer aware of the cost of the war on the African country, on Somalia in particular.
Yeah.
So when we talk about why is the U.S. bombing in Somalia? Yes, it's under the veneer of trying to create peace and stability in a troubled region. But if we even take its word for it, it's not yielding any results on the ground. These wars have been going, the bombings have been going on, the attacks have been going on as well. Al-Shabaab is no less, of a threat to Somalia and Kenya and the regional countries than when it controlled portions of Somalia, greater portion of Somalia, and was even, holding the capital. And it took AMISOM, which is the African mission in Somalia, a very strong military effort and coalition from the continent to push back Al-Shabaab from Somalia's capital, Mogadishu, in 2011. This shows that Africans themselves and the regional armies have the capacity to get the job done. So then,
right? do you think the way that the Africans should then be the ones taking the helm here? Because then that can also be problematic, right? Where Africa, as we, those of us who are not African and live outside Africa, unfortunately, we have this narrative in our minds about Africa as just being one collective, right? But each of the nations of Africa have their own national interests as well. So, if the AU were to sweep into Somalia, would that necessarily be a good thing?
It won't be. Somalia has had a very troubled, past. Over the last 30 to 40 years, it has been locked in sectarianism, and clan clashes, even a civil war, and there are many other issues of poverty, and that is driving the problems that the country is facing today. But to think that a foreign power can just step in to solve the problem without paying keen attention to the regional dynamics and even the dynamics within the country, and recognizing the agency of Somalis to solve their problem, and also paying real regard to political process, because you cannot solve political issues with military force. And that's one of the problems that has plagued U.S. strategy. You just can't go about relying on bombs to solve problems that the military cannot solve. So if we're looking at even how the situation is right now, the U.S. is pulling out troops from Somalia, it says, but they're actually going to Kenya. These troops are not going back to the United States. So it's sort of Trump trying to appeal to his base by saying, I'm living up to the promise of ending forever wars. He is not. If anything, he has expanded it. And that's something that people need to realize, and that is not made public information or publicized well enough.
So, okay, then as a final comment then before I let you go, Ovigwe, on the issue then of civilian casualties, right? As the issue with Afghanistan, for example, the peace process there's always this issue of accountability and justice, right? Because if we want, for example, Somalia to become a stable country and to be politically united within all of its different parties as well, we would need to have accountability of some sort, right? Every Somali life has to also matter to the international community. Is Somalia in a position to even do that for its own citizens? How important would that be in this process?
Oh, that would be crucially important. For instance, the Somalis are preparing for an election, and just days ago, you could see several international partners, and European countries as well, joined with the government, stakeholders in the electoral process, trying to set like an agenda for a smooth election. That shows that it's possible. Even as we're looking at the cases in Afghanistan, if you want a peace process to hold, especially in a country that has not had they are not known for having peaceful election or peaceful transition of power, you want to invest heavily in a political process more than the military might, and that's not what we're seeing, whether it's in Afghanistan, or in Somalia. There's a troop drawdown, yes, but that's not necessarily the solution. It's not going to lead to anything very impactful, because mind you would see, for instance, the moment a next administration comes in, there's going to be an escalation again, and then they send more troops. We saw that Obama came in, said they were going to call down troops, replace that with drone wars. Trump came in saying he's going to bring back troops and then increase area bombardment, and also even increasing troop deployment to Afghanistan. You have to recognize that as well. So and whenever there's a troop drawdown, you always hear the dynamics of geopolitics coming in. For instance, you will hear now them saying, if the US pulls back too much from Somalia, then Turkey, which has the biggest overseas base in Somalia, would expand and close that space. This is how they view these countries, always from that geopolitical competition and rivalry, not necessarily putting the center on peace and stability of the countries from the perspective of Somalis themselves.
That's a very good point to Ovigwe. We really appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule to speak to us today. That was Ovigwe Eguegu speaking to us there from Abuja, sharing his expertise there with us about Somalia, U.S. involvement there, and just in general the situation within Somalia, right? I mean, it's a country, unfortunately, that we do not talk enough about because, again, it just seems like an information black hole. The U.S. has been involved in Somalia for a significant amount of time. Significant numbers of civilians have been killed there. The U.S. initially had said, we have not killed a single civilian there. Then Amnesty International called it out on that. And then Air Wars has proven that the 5 civilians which the U.S. has admitted that it has killed is in fact a very, very low number. And the number is much higher. It's between somewhere 69 and 142 deaths over these years of operations. And that's probably a lower estimate as well, considering, again, as I said, it's very hard to get information when it comes to the U.S. operations in Somalia and who's being responsible for the many civilian deaths and suffering in that country as well. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to continue to discuss the situation in France. And, you know, I don't want to overstate the situation, but it certainly is extremely worrying, the direction in which the country is headed, right, vis-a-vis its own relationship with its Muslim citizens. As I have said on this show a number of times in the past, a law is now being considered in the French Assembly, which would essentially see internment camps set up for Muslims, those who have, quote-unquote, radical ideas of some sort, have not committed any crimes, by the way, but are just considered radical for possibly their ideas. And again, the definition of radical is a fairly loose one, if we're completely honest. This has been tabled by a far-right politician. It may not pass, but even if it doesn't, it still, again, goes to show the kinds of conversations that are now fairly acceptable to be had in France, where your targeting of a specific group of people because of their faith is seemingly acceptable even now by French lawmakers. On top of that, we've also had, interestingly, the U.S. Envoy for religious freedom. And it's not like the U.S. is an epitome or, you know, a moral example of these sorts of things. But even if that country's religious envoy now expresses worry about what's happening in France, that's probably something which is quite telling vis-a-vis the direction, again, that this country is heading in. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Hamid, who is a political commentator. He's also a columnist and journalist, joining us from Paris. Also joining us from the French capital is Abdennour Toumi, who is the North Africa expert at Center for Middle Eastern Studies, or also known as ORSAM. And joining us from Lyon is Monia, who is a member of the Coordination Against Racism and Islamophobia. Monia, Abdennour, and Hamid, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Monia, I'd like to start with you. Firstly, let's talk about this camp, these internment camps, and this bill in front of the French Assembly. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, the current law says that you can't detain somebody if there has been no criminal procedure. And in France, we have the concept of presumption of innocence. So we're worried that this new bill is actually incompatible with the rule of law. If this is really serious, if the bill becomes a law, then it would result in returning French citizens who are on a so-called radicalization watch list, and they would be sent officially to detention centers for several days and even months. We have a simple question: who will be targeted? Because, as you said, the definition of radicalization is not really clear. It hasn't been defined.
Yeah, and that's a very, isn't it, Abdennour? Because until we don't define what the French government means by radical, it's very hard to understand what's going on here, right? I mean, if this were to move forward, how would this affect Muslims, do you think?
Actually, it does affect the Muslims in France directly. However, I think the government seems to be lost in traction and translation. Just a week ago, President Macron had given an interview to an online alternative media called Brut, asking him on this sensitive issue, and he said, okay, well, France doesn't have a problem with Islam. Sure, we know. But the question is, his interior minister, who is pushing very, very hard, and in his mind and also political agenda, that his aim are now the Muslims. Without naming them directly, even himself just 2 days ago, he gave an interview on a national French network saying the same thing like his president. But I believe the question of this thorny issue, and it doesn't actually, it's very, very old in the French debate. Unfortunately, there is no debate nowadays. It is a paradox according to the message and the discourse, which is usually led by the Front National, ex-Front National, the Rassemblement National. So in this blurry situation, also the government is trying to make sure this time that France will domesticate the Muslims.
How are your thoughts on that? Because, I mean, at this point, it also seems in some ways that this has become a slippery slope, right? It's a runaway train almost. How does one even stop the situation from getting worse for Muslims?
Yeah, we've seen that there is a kind of running between the Conservative Party and the presidential party En Marche. We know that the French President Emmanuel Macron wants to go for the next election in 2022. But Emmanuel Macron, as he said, the previous guest, Abdennour, Toumi, he gave an interview in Brut, the online site, saying that there is a police brutality and discrimination and even Islamophobia in France. So we've seen that there is a change between the interior minister and Macron. There is kind of disagreement between together. Macron realized that he needs his left, his branch left to win the next election. So he was advised, obviously, by the importance of having, this youth generation, and he realized also that during the protest last week, that there were a massive youth generation which are protesting against the police brutality, but against also the discrimination. And when you talk about the discrimination, there's obviously links which is linked to Islamophobia. So Emmanuel Macron is not a naive president, is I will say clumsy president, but he knows that if he wants to win for 2022, the next election, he has to consolidate his left branch party to, of course, win the next election. I think it's a strategy for the French president, and he knows what he's doing.
Monia, it was interesting because the French foreign minister was in Qatar, and he was telling us and the world that, listen, we are not Islamophobic, i.e. France is not Islamophobic. We have nothing against Islam, that the media has distorted what is happening. All three of you are on the ground. Are we distorting what is happening in France?
Absolutely not. This is exactly what we feel here in France. The Muslim community in France has the impression that we are being stigmatized and scapegoated. We are not delusional. I mean, what Macron says is totally contrary to what his government and his prime minister and minister of interior are doing, and the bills they are passing. Obviously, this bill was proposed by a former far-right member called Guillaume Pelletier. He is not part of Macron's government, and hopefully this bill will not pass and it will not become a law. But we fear that this is a sort of trial balloon in order to test the public's reaction and see if the French population is ready to accept such a restrictive law. They're using the fear of terrorist attacks, and Macron is actually using the far-right ideology in order to impose an oppressive rule. And us Muslims have the impression that we are considered as second-class citizens. We're not full-fledged citizens, honestly.
Noor, it was interesting, right? The U.S. Envoy for Religious Freedom, as I said in my introduction, he made a statement saying he was concerned and worried about what is going on in France. And I'm going to quote him directly now. And he said, when you are too repressive, the situation can in fact get worse. But constructive dialogue can be useful. So, I mean, right now we are seeing, am I right to say, a repressive situation? And, how much worse can this get? Because this means that essentially people can, if they're pushed into a corner, can also act out, right?
Sure. I mean, it's a strong statement and a very, very solid word. The word repressive. But actually, the Americans have their own experience with the Muslims, and also religion in the U.S. It's not that taboo to the Americans and also to the American politicians. Whereas here in France, it's kind of, I say, hypocrite behavior of the politicians and the media. So they are basing their argument and pushing their argument for that France is a secular country, and doesn't pay any attention to any religions. Nevertheless, the secularism or laicity is still somehow the religion of the French state. But to answer to your question, to your direct question, I think the French government and the media who are behind this should be very, very careful for the next coming months, because right now the Muslim community, and again, I will say the Muslim communities are paying attention to this issue and are worried. Meanwhile, they are continuing their life as business as usual, worrying about the future of their children and working very hard to make a better life for their children. Yeah. However, the next months will be determined on this issue, and I believe the French politicians should be very, very careful, and notably the President Macron himself, because as stated earlier, he makes this narrative for his strategic campaign in the 2022, Indeed. But I think it's too late for him.
All right, Hamid, I'll give you the word before I let three of you go. We have about a minute left. What happens now? Because now that we have even the United States expressing concern, does this mean that even France's allies around the world will tell it more and more that what it's doing is wrong towards its own Muslim citizens?
Yeah, as you mentioned, it's a very good point. As you mentioned, yeah, France is now going down. The situation and the social economic is very worrying in this situation. There's more than 1 million in employment. The youth generation, they don't have any future for the job. As you said, Macron, when he delivered his speech 2 months ago, when he said that Islam is in crisis, we've seen a kind of solidarity in the Muslim world against Macron's government and his policies. So this is, it's very ironic that the United States give a support to the French Muslim community than, despite of should have given for the French Muslim. So we've seen that Emmanuel Macron has isolated himself, about this issue, and we've seen a kind of a strong, a huge protest in the world, in the Muslim world, but not also in the English news press and in the Muslim world against Emmanuel Macron and his policies. So he has to really change his policies and to more ask and consolidate and to also cooperate with the French Muslim to build a peaceful relationship in France. Indeed. And to give the opportunity to the French Muslim to participate in their own country.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that. We'll appreciate all three of our guests, Hamid, Abdennour, and Monia, for taking their time out of their busy schedules to share their expertise with us. Monia speaking to us from Lyon, and Abdennour and Hamid were both speaking to us from the French capital, Paris, discussing, this very disturbing law, as I put in my introduction, about internment of Muslims. Again, this definition of the word radical is not right now completely known and understood. I mean, will this be a very subjective way of looking at things? Who exactly will decide who is a radical Muslim or not? How exactly will we reach that conclusion? And then what then happens when they're put into those detention camps? How long are they put away for? What exactly is all this meant to achieve necessarily for anybody involved, be it just non-Muslim citizens or even the Muslim citizens themselves? A lot of confusion, of course, and certainly the optics of it aren't good, especially within the context of what we're talking about that has happened in France of recent vis-a-vis its own Muslim citizens. And it's very important to always highlight the fact that we are talking about Muslim citizens of France, generations of Muslims that have lived in France in peace, side by side with regular French citizens of other faiths, ethnicities, etc., in peace. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.